This really happened to me, and even now, retelling it still makes my hands shake. It all started with the old oak desk in my brother's study. That's where I found the will they forged, the one that stripped me of everything my parents ever intended for me. My own blood. My niece and nephew sat smugly in that room, sipping bourbon as if the world already belonged to them. When I held that piece of paper in my trembling hands, I realized they had written me out of my own family legacy. At 70 years old, I was supposed to fade away, quietly, humiliated and defeated. But they had no idea the fire they had just lit inside me. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I should probably start at the beginning, because if you don't understand where I came from, you won't understand just how brutal their betrayal was. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, in a brick colonial house on Whitaker Street that seemed to carry every echo of my parents' dreams. My father, Samuel Hamilton, had served in the Army, a man of quiet strength and a rigid sense of duty. My mother, Eleanor, was a schoolteacher, patient and thoughtful, with the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing. Together, they built a life carefully, brick by brick, tradition by tradition, until every item in the house seemed infused with meaning. We weren't rich at first. My father started out working long shifts at the docks, while my mother stretched pennies to cover groceries. But they believed in sacrifice. They saved, invested, and reinvested. Over decades, they managed to buy several rental properties across Savannah, a summer cottage on Tybee Island, and even a modest stake in a historic inn downtown. My childhood was colored by the smell of pecan pie, cooling on the counter, the heavy drone of cicadas screaming in the summer dusk, and the creak of hardwood floors that always seemed to give away your secrets. My older brother Richard and I couldn't have been more different. Richard was the golden child, athletic, charming, endlessly confident. He was captain of the high school football team, the kind of boy whose smile could win over teachers and girls alike. I was quieter, bookish, always buried in novels or sketching plans in the margins of my notebooks. Our parents loved us both, but they leaned on me for the details, the behind-the-scenes work. When Dad's memory began to fade a little, I was the one paying bills. When Mom wanted to catalog her antique china, I was the one writing down each item. I thought that would count for something. But life has a cruel way of teaching you who people really are. Richard died young, 60, leaving behind 2 children, Emily and Mark. At first, I pitied them. Emily had been a bright, ambitious girl. Mark, a restless young man who never seemed to settle into anything. They had lost their father, and though we had never been close, I tried to step into the role of second parent. I paid for Emily's last semester at the University of Georgia. When her scholarship fell through, I helped Mark land an interview at the inn we partly owned. I thought naively that kindness would weave us closer together. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first real hint of trouble came at my mother's funeral. She lived to nearly 95 sharp, almost until the very end. The service at Bonaventure Cemetery was a sea of Spanish moss and marble angels, a scene so steeped in Savannah's history that it felt timeless. I remember standing there numb with grief when I noticed Emily whispering to Mark. Their eyes darted to me, then away, lips curled into the kind of smiles that weren't born of sadness. Something about it unsettled me, though I told myself, grief makes people act strangely. After the service, when we gathered at the house, the family lawyer, Mr. Donnelly, pulled me aside and said he'd need to meet with me privately about estate documents. Emily immediately objected, her voice smooth but insistent. Shouldn't we all see them together? We're family after all. I thought it was odd, but I brushed it aside. I trusted the law, trusted the process. That trust was my mistake. Weeks later, I walked into Richard's study. The heavy oak desk still smelled faintly of his cigars, the bourbon decanter glinting in the afternoon light, and my stomach dropped. The will had changed. My name, once clearly listed as a 50% heir to everything, was gone. Instead, the properties, the house, the inn, every piece of my parents' legacy had been gifted entirely to Emily and Mark. The language was precise, clinical, merciless. Emily sat there, legs crossed in her designer boots, her smirk almost polite. It's nothing personal. Uncle Grandma just thought it would be simpler this way. Simpler. That word tasted like poison in my mouth. For a moment, I wanted to scream, to slam my fist into that desk, to rip the smugness right off her face. But 70 years of life had taught me something more useful than rage. It had taught me patience. I swallowed my fury, tucked the will back into the desk drawer, and walked out. Because right then and there, I promised myself something I would make them regret underestimating me. That evening, I drove home with my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Savannah blurred past the old live oaks, the lamp posts, the cobblestone squares, until I pulled up to my parents' house. It looked like a ghost in the moonlight, empty and hollow. I sat in the car for nearly an hour, mosquitoes tapping at the glass, trying to breathe past the weight pressing down on my chest. Inside, I poured myself a bourbon, though I had never liked the taste. It burned all the way down, but I wanted it to. I wanted something to match the fire inside me. I replayed Emily's words, simpler this way, again and again, until it felt like they were carved into the walls. The next morning, I called Mr. Donnelly. He had been our lawyer for decades, sharp as a tack with his silver hair and clipped voice. But when I asked him about the changes, there was a pause. Too long of a pause. Then he said, "Well, sometimes your mother." She got confused in her later years. Perhaps she wanted to simplify things. Simplify, the same word Emily had used. It wasn't coincidence. I pressed him for details. When exactly had the will been updated? He dodged, claimed he didn't have the file in front of him. His answers were too smooth, too rehearsed. That's when suspicion dug its claws into me. That night I went digging. I pulled open every drawer, every cabinet, rifling through decades of papers. My parents were meticulous. If they had changed the will, there would be something. A draft, a note, a letter. But there was nothing, except a single photocopy of the original will, tucked between my father's old Army discharge papers. My name right there, 50% heir. That's when suspicion hardened into certainty. But suspicion alone doesn't win in court. Emily and Mark were clever, ruthless. Emily had the polish of a corporate lawyer, the kind of woman who smiled as she slipped a knife into your back. Mark was sloppier, but he had charm and youth on his side. Together they made a dangerous pair. I couldn't fight them head-on, not yet. So I decided to wait, to watch, to learn. And as I played the role of the doddering old uncle, they had no idea that every smile, every careless slip of the tongue was fuel for the fire I was building. The weeks that followed were some of the longest of my life. By day, I played the part of the grieving, aging uncle who was too tired to fight. By night, I became something else entirely. I couldn't sleep, not with the memory of that forged will searing itself into my mind. I'd pace the creaky floors of the Whitaker Street house, running my hands along the banister polished by generations, thinking about my parents. I remembered sitting with my father at that oak desk when I was 16, watching him carefully balance the books for the rental properties. Money, he told me, isn't about what you buy. It's about what you protect. You protect it, so it can protect the family. My mother would peek her head in, smile, and add, and family protects each other. That's what stung the most. Emily and Mark weren't just stealing from me. They were shattering everything my parents had worked for. I knew I needed proof, but proof doesn't fall into your lap. I started with Donnelly. Every time I called, he fed me the same lines: confusion, simplification. Your mother wanted it this way. His words were as polished as marble, but I could hear the cracks. He was hiding something. So I began tailing him. Not in a Hollywood way. No trench coats or binoculars, but with the quiet persistence of a man who had spent 70 years observing id sit in my Buick across from his Bull Street office, sipping coffee, watching who came and went. Most days were ordinary clients, secretaries, deliveries. But twice, I saw Emily walk in. She always wore black heels, always carried a leather portfolio, and she always looked too comfortable. Walking into a place she should have had no business being. One evening, I waited longer than usual until the streetlights flickered on and the cicadas hummed against the dark. When the last light in Donnelly's office went out, I stepped from the car and walked the block. I wasn't breaking in. I just wanted to see. The side door lock was scratched worn, the kind of wear you only get from being opened too often. My suspicions deepened. Back home, I laid out my parents' papers again. Every deed, every tax return, every note Mom had scribbled in her looping script. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the photocopy of the original will, comparing it to the forged one I'd glimpsed at Richard's desk. The differences gnawed at me. My mother's signature always had a distinctive loop in the E. On the forged version, that loop was flat, mechanical. But I needed more than instinct. That's when I called Tomas. He'd been an old friend from my younger days. The kind of man Savannah society pretended not to know. He ran a quiet print shop off Broughton Street, and while most folks thought he just made posters and flyers, I knew better. Years ago, Tomas had dabbled in forgery movie tickets, fake IDs, things that could get a man in trouble. He'd gone straight, or so he claimed. But I knew he still had an eye for ink. When I showed him the photos of the forged will, it managed to sneak during one of my visits. He squinted through a magnifying glass, then pulled out a blacklight. "Not your mama's hand," he muttered, shaking his head. "Whoever did this, they tried hard. Ink flows off. Pressure points are wrong. This is practiced, not natural." The words felt like oxygen after weeks of suffocation. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. This was fraud. Still, I needed the originals. Copies wouldn't hold in court, and I knew exactly where they were. For days, I planned it. I drove by Donnelly's office at different times, learning his patterns, the way his secretary arrived early and left the side door unlocked for deliveries. I rehearsed it in my head. Walk in, find the file, take the photos, walk out simple. But at 70, nothing feels simple. My knees ached. My heart thudded too hard whenever I thought about it. Yet desperation has a way of making a man young again. That Thursday night, when the last light clicked off inside, I slipped from the car and walked to the side door. My palms sweated as I turned the knob. It opened with a soft click. Inside, the office smelled of paper and old carpet. The filing cabinets gleamed faintly under the exit signs. Glow, I found the drawer marked Hamilton. Estate slid it open, and there they were, 2 wills. The original dated 5 years earlier, my name bold and clear, and the forged one dated less than 3 weeks before my mother's death. My throat tightened. By then, she couldn't even sign her name to a birthday card. Hands trembling, I snapped photos of every page, careful. to put everything back exactly as I'd found it. My heart hammered as I slipped back into the night, every shadow feeling like a pair of eyes. When I finally sank into my Buick's seat, I exhaled so hard, it fogged the windshield. Back home, I spread the photos across my desk. Proof solid, undeniable proof, but a voice in the back of my mind whispered, "Not yet." If I rushed, this Emily and Mark would unleash their lawyers and paint me as a bitter old man chasing money. I couldn't just beat them in court. I had to ruin them first, strip away their armor until the truth crushed them. So I played my part. I showed up to Emily's sleek Atlanta condo for her housewarming, carrying a bottle of wine I couldn't afford, pretending to admire her marble countertops and rooftop view. I sat at the Gray, with Mark listening as he mispronounced the name of an expensive Bordeaux, pretending to laugh at his careless jokes. All the while I was taking notes. It didn't take long for cracks to show. Emily let slip that Donnelly had been so accommodating during the estate process. Too accommodating. Mark, drunk one night, leaned across the bar and bragged, "The signatures look clean. Man, like, she never even held the pen." They thought I was deaf or too old to matter. But I was listening, and I was patient. I began with whispers, quiet doubts seeded in the right ears. Old church friends, family acquaintances, neighbors who thrived on gossip. "I'm just not sure. Mom was well enough to change the will," I'd murmur. "It doesn't feel like something she'd do." Savannah is a city that thrives on whispers. Within weeks, people were talking. Emily was asked point blank if she'd pressured her grandmother. Mark started losing his temper in public, snapping at waiters storming out of bars. Every time he faltered, I made sure someone important saw it. They didn't realize it, but their armor was already cracking, and I hadn't even truly begun. There's something dangerous about arrogance. Something intoxicating to the person who wears it and infuriating to those who have to watch. I saw it building in Emily and Mark, like a storm on the horizon, smug and thick with lightning, and I knew if I let them keep strutting, their own pride would eventually hang them. But to the world for a time, they looked untouchable. Emily was the first to rise higher. Her career in Atlanta's legal circles gave her a sheen of respectability that money alone couldn't buy. At charity galas, she posed for glossy photographs in sequined gowns, her name popping up in society pages with headlines like "Rising Star Attorney Emily Hamilton hosts fundraiser for children's literacy." Whenever I visited her home was staged like a magazine, spread designer furniture, curated art pieces, wine bottles lined up like trophies on display. She spoke to me with the kind of casual condescension people reserve for those they consider finished. "Uncle," she'd say, resting a manicured hand on my arm, "I hope you're taking care of yourself. Retirement can be lonely." She said it with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mark, on the other hand, played the role of the carefree heir. He strutted through Savannah's bars and restaurants as though he owned the city. At Molly McPherson's, I overheard him boasting to friends that he and his sister had streamlined the inheritance and that the family legacy was finally in the right hands. His friends laughed, toasted him, and I watched quietly from the corner, swirling a glass of water I had no intention of drinking. At first, their confidence worked. Whispers about me began to circulate, old bitter, resentful. A cousin I hadn't seen in years cornered me at a family gathering and asked gently, "Are you sure you're remembering things right, Abner? You know how age can play tricks." The words cut deeper than he realized. I went home that night and stared at myself in the mirror. The lines on my face seemed deeper. My hands trembled a little more than usual. For one awful moment I questioned myself. Was I chasing ghosts? Was I letting grief twist my mind? But then I opened the drawer, pulled out the photos of the wills, and stared at the loop in my mother's. Real signature. I traced it with my fingertip. No, I wasn't wrong. I wasn't losing my mind. They were the liars. Emily's arrogance swelled when she made the short list for junior partner at her firm. She called me one evening, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction. "Uncle, isn't it funny? Grandma always said, hard work pays off." I guess she knew what she was doing when she entrusted me with the estate. Entrusted. That word nearly made me drop the phone. She wasn't just smug, she was rewriting history. Mark's smugness came in a different form. He began driving a brand new Lexus through the narrow Savannah street's windows, down blasting music. He picked up the tab at bars, waving his black Amex like a flag house. Money, he bragged once, to laughter. House money. It wasn't just disrespect, it was desecration. I realized then how important appearances were to them. Emily's power came from her spotless image. The ambitious lawyer, the devoted niece, the charitable socialite Mark's, came from the illusion of wealth and bravado, the playboy who never failed. If I wanted to ruin them, I had to strike at those illusions. I had to make the world see them as they truly were. So I began watching closer. At Emily's galas, I noticed her lingering too long beside her senior partner, a married man with a wife who often didn't attend events. His hand brushed hers once, and she didn't pull away. Later, I saw them slip out the side door together. 20 minutes before dessert was served, I filed that away. Mark, meanwhile, couldn't keep his vices hidden. One night at the sportsbook tucked behind a dive bar off Victory Drive, I saw him slap down a wad of cash so thick it startled the bookie. 20 grand, he slurred. Bulldogs cover the spread, I'm rich. He lost by halftime. By closing, he was begging for credit. I recorded it. All his brags, his desperation. The way the bartender shook his head and muttered, "Man, you're gonna drown yourself." I knew it wasn't enough to just have evidence. I had to build a stage, make them unravel under the brightest lights possible. But first, I had to make sure people were watching. Savannah is a city of whispers, and I knew exactly how to plant them. Over coffee with old friends at Clary's Cafe. He'd sigh and say, "Emily's doing well, isn't she?" Though I hear the firm's not too happy about appearances, I'd leave it vague, just enough to stick over drinks at the Pirate's house. He'd shake my head and say, "Mark's got a taste for gambling. Dangerous habit. Not sure hell keep his grip on the properties long. I didn't have to do much more. Gossip spreads like fire in dry brush." Within weeks, Emily's colleagues were side-eyeing her at firm events, and Mark was being turned away for credit in bars, where he'd once been welcome. But they were still standing still. Smug. Still convinced I was nothing more than a bitter old man. I remember one evening in particular. Emily had driven down from Atlanta, and Mark threw a dinner party at the Tybee Island house. I wasn't invited, but word travels fast. They'd hired a caterer, filled the rooms with music and laughter, and toasted each other, as though the house had always been theirs. Someone later told me Emily had raised a glass and said, "To family, and to letting go of the past." Letting go of the past. That was when I knew. They weren't going to slip up on their own. I had to force the cracks wider, pry them apart until their entire world collapsed. Patience, I told myself. Patience and precision. And so I sharpened my plan one piece at a time, like a blade against stone. There's a moment in every long game when patience hardens into resolve. Mine came. One restless night, sitting alone at the kitchen table with the photocopy of my parents. Real will spread out before me. The lamp's yellow glow cast long shadows over the page, and my mother's looping E in Eleanor seemed to look back at me like a pair of eyes. I could almost hear her voice, soft but firm. Family protects each other. That's when I decided I wouldn't just fight them in court. I would dismantle them piece by piece. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and started to write. Not a diary. Not notes plans. Who they trusted. Where they were vulnerable. How I could turn their arrogance against them. I wasn't going to confront them. Head on like a fool. I was going to let them walk into their own traps, smiling until they realized the jaws had snapped shut. Emily's weak spot was her image. Every polished photo, every carefully crafted word, every gala she threw her career depended on her reputation. If I could smear even a drop of ink on that spotless canvas, it would bleed across everything she'd built. Mark's weak spot was his appetites. Gambling, drinking fast. Cars, fast talk. He wasn't careful, never had been. He thought confidence could cover incompetence. If I could amplify his recklessness, make it visible, his downfall would right itself. And Donnelly, the old lawyer, who'd helped them. I wasn't sure, yet whether he was an active conspirator or just a coward who looked the other way. Either way, he was going to burn with them if he didn't come clean. The first step was patience. I had to keep playing the role of the doddering uncle, smiling at their insults, thanking them for handling things. While underneath, I was setting the stage. I began with Emily. I knew about her senior partner, the married man whose hand lingered a little too long at galas. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. I needed something concrete, something undeniable. So I drove to Atlanta one Friday afternoon and checked into a nondescript hotel across from her firm. For 2 days I watched. I sat in the lobby cafe with a newspaper sipping coffee slowly, my eyes hidden behind reading glasses. And sure enough, Saturday night, I saw her, Emily, in a navy dress, hair shining under the streetlights, walking arm in arm, with the partner heading not to a work event, but to a quiet French restaurant on Peachtree Street. They laughed like lovers, not colleagues. Later, they came out, his hand on her waist, her face tilted up toward his. I snapped photos with a disposable camera, old-fashioned, easy to hide, nothing traceable to me. Back in my hotel room, I developed the plan further. These photos weren't for blackmail. No, that would be too obvious, too easily dismissed as family revenge. These photos would go to the people who could hurt her most. Her firm's managing partner, his wife, the state bar if need be. I tucked the camera into my bag and drove home, the road humming beneath my tires, a quiet satisfaction curling in my chest. Mark was even easier. His habits betrayed him. Every Saturday night he parked his Lexus outside Molly McPherson's, drank too much and bragged louder than he should. I became a regular, there blending into the background, nursing one drink for hours. I learned which bookie he used, which bartenders hated him, which waitresses he stiffed on tips. One night he went too far. He staggered out to the parking lot, shouting into his phone about owing 20 grand and threatening someone I couldn't hear. He threw the phone at his car, denting the door, then slumped against it, muttering, "Uncle's too old to fight anyway. It's ours, all of it." I caught every word on a recorder I'd tucked in my pocket. The next morning I made a copy and mailed it anonymously to the bank officer I knew had been considering financing his next project. Within a week, Mark's financing dried up. By the second week, he was ranting in public about people sabotaging him. It was almost too easy. But I wasn't satisfied with private cracks. I wanted their downfall to be public, undeniable. So I set the date, a family gathering at the Tybee Island house. I sent invitations to cousins, old family friends, even a few of my parents' business partners. A memorial celebration of Eleanor's life. I wrote in careful script. Everyone loved my mother. They would come. The day of the gathering, the house smelled of salt water and fried shrimp from the platters I'd ordered. People filled the living room, laughing, sharing stories. Emily and Mark arrived late, of course dressed to impress. Emily in a cream suit. Mark in a navy blazer, sunglasses still perched on his head indoors. They kissed cheeks, accepted compliments, and settled in like royalty. I let the evening build. Let the wine flow. Let laughter soften the edges. And then, when the room was full, I stood near the fireplace and raised my glass. "I want to show you something my parents left behind," I said, my voice steady. I pulled the photocopy of the original will from my jacket pocket and held it up. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Emily froze. Mark's jaw clenched. "This," I continued, "was the will my parents signed, the one they intended, the one that named me as rightful heir. Funny thing, though, when the estate was settled, this version vanished, replaced by another. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. People shifted, exchanged looks. Emily's face drained of color. Finally, she forced a laugh, brittle as glass. "Uncle, really, this isn't the time." But her voice wavered, and that was all it took. Whispers spread like wildfire in that room. Doubt settled in like smoke. Friends who had praised Emily moments before now looked at her with narrowed eyes. Mark muttered something about drama, but no one laughed. I let the silence linger, then tucked the will back into my pocket and raised my glass again. "To Eleanor Hamilton," I said, "a woman who valued honesty above all else." The toast was echoed, but the room wasn't warm anymore. It was cold, sharp, suspicious. I had cracked their armor in public. Now it was time to break it entirely. Over the next week, I mailed every piece of evidence I had. To mass analysis, photos of the wills, recordings of Mark's drunken boasts, and the photos of Emily with her partner, to the district attorney's office and the state bar. No name on the envelope, no fingerprints, just truth delivered like a dagger. The waiting was the hardest part. But when the phone finally rang, a reporter asking for my comment on allegations of fraud concerning the Hamilton estate, I knew the trap had sprung. Emily and Mark weren't untouchable anymore. They were prey. And I was just getting started. The storm broke slowly at first, like rain tapping on a tin roof before the downpour. It began with whispers in Savannah's tight-knit social circles. At the Sunday service at Christ Church, I caught people glancing at Emily and Mark, their conversations hushed and clipped. At Leopold's ice cream one afternoon, I overheard two women murmuring, "Did you hear about the will? Poor Abner to be cut out like that." The whispers weren't pitying. They were suspicious, sharp like blades pressed under the skin. Emily felt it before Mark did. I could see it in the way she carried herself at family functions. Still proud, still polished, but her eyes darted her smile too wide, her laugh forced. Her career had made her sensitive to tone, to the slight shift in how people said her name, and now every time someone paused before speaking, she flinched. Mark was slower to notice. He was too busy unraveling. The banker who had once entertained his business proposals now refused his calls. A local contractor he'd promised big investments to suddenly pulled out of their deal. One night at the Pink House, I watched him throw a tantrum at a waiter because his credit card had been declined. By the time dessert was served, half the restaurant was whispering, but gossip was just the beginning. A month after the Tybee Island gathering, Emily's firm released a statement. Effective immediately, Emily Hamilton will no longer be with the firm. We wish her the best in her future endeavors. The words were sterile, but everyone in Atlanta knew what they meant. She hadn't left by choice. She'd been pushed. I imagined her packing her office into cardboard boxes, her colleagues avoiding her gaze, her once glittering path to partnership snuffed out like a candle. Mark's fall came faster. The recordings I'd sent to the district attorney made their way into the right hands, and soon he was under investigation, not just for fraud tied to the will, but for unrelated financial misdeeds. His gambling debts had left a trail, and the DA pulled every thread. When the subpoenas arrived, the smug smiles disappeared. The hearings were scheduled at the Chatham County Courthouse. I remember the first day vividly, the marble steps gleaming in the sun, the crowd of reporters clutching notepads and microphones, the curious locals craning their necks for a glimpse, and me walking up those steps, slowly cane in hand, feeling the weight of 70 years and the satisfaction of knowing I was about to watch them squirm. Inside the courtroom, buzzed with anticipation. The prosecutor laid out the evidence piece by piece. The will altered mere weeks before my mother's death. The inconsistent signatures, the shady notary who couldn't even remember being present. Tomas' handwriting analysis was presented as expert testimony, his quiet voice steady as he explained why the forged signature was practiced rather than natural. Emily sat at the defense table, her cream suit replaced by something drabber, her once sharp posture stiff with fear. She tried to keep her face neutral, but I saw the twitch at the corner of her mouth, the way she clenched her jaw when the prosecutor displayed the original will on the projector screen. Mark was worse. He slouched his blazer, rumpled his eyes darting like a trapped animal. When the recording of his drunken brag played, the signatures looked clean, manlike she never even held. The Penthy jury leaned forward, their faces tightening. Gasps filled the benches behind me. The courtroom became theater, and Emily and Mark the unwilling stars. I sat in the back, silent, my cane resting across my knees. Every so often when Emily's eyes flicked toward me, I gave her the smallest smile. It was enough. Her voice wavered when she spoke, her rehearsed answers unraveling into stammers. Mark tried bravado. Uncle's just bitter. He never appreciated what Grandma wanted, but the prosecutor cut him down with documents, receipts, witnesses. Their power was gone. Outside the courthouse, the press circled like vultures. Headlines appeared in the Savannah Morning News. Hamilton heirs, accused of forgery, family legacy, in dispute. Their faces were splashed across television screens, not as rising stars or local benefactors, but as frauds. The punishment didn't stop at the courthouse steps. Emily's so-called friends stopped returning her calls. Invitations dried up. When she showed up to a fundraiser, people whispered behind her back. Their smiles, tight, their eyes cold. Mark, once the life of Savannah's nightlife, found himself unwelcome at bars he'd once treated like his living room. Bartenders shook their heads. Bouncers told him flatly, "Not tonight." And me, I walked through the city with my head high, for the first time in years. But revenge isn't just about watching someone lose. It's about taking back what they stole. The court eventually ruled. The forged will, invalid, my rightful inheritance, was restored. The properties, the inn, the house that had stood on Whitaker Street for generations. Signing those papers felt like laying bricks on solid ground again, like rebuilding the foundation my parents had left me. Still, I wasn't content. I wanted them broken, humiliated, forced to live with the knowledge that they'd been destroyed by the man they thought too old, too weak, too irrelevant to matter. So when Emily took the stand, one final time, her voice trembling as she swore she hadn't known the will was fake, I leaned forward just enough for her to see my face. I let a slow smile curve across my lips. Her eyes widened. She faltered. The jury noticed. And in that moment she knew. She knew it had been me all along. That night, as I left the courthouse under the fading Georgia sun, I felt lighter than I had in decades. The cicadas sang from the trees and the air smelled of salt and history. I wasn't just avenged. I was alive again. But the storm wasn't over, because revenge has a way of echoing long after the verdict is read. The courthouse felt colder on verdict day, though the Georgia sun outside was blinding. Reporters gathered on the marble steps, cameras perched, like vultures ready to pick at whatever remained of Emily and Mark's pride. I arrived early, cane tapping against the stone heart. Steady 70 years teaches you patience, and patience had finally carried me to this moment. Inside the courtroom was packed. Family, old friends, strangers, who had followed the scandal, all eager to see the outcome. I sat in the same back row bench I had claimed every session, my spot of quiet power. The prosecutor spoke with the sharpness of a blade, outlining every piece of evidence, the forged signatures, the notary's inconsistent testimony, Tomas' expert analysis, and Mark's drunken confessions. Piece by piece, the wall Emily and Mark had built came crashing down. The defense tried desperation. Emily's lawyer painted me as a bitter uncle clinging to relevance, suggesting perhaps my memory wasn't reliable. He called me elderly more than once, as though age were a crime. But the jury had seen the documents, heard the recordings, watched Emily squirm under cross-examination. Words couldn't erase what was already burned into their minds. When the jury filed back in after deliberations, I held my breath. The foreman stood paper in hand and read, "Guilty of fraud, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of forgery." The words rang out like church bells. Emily's face went white as marble. Mark slumped forward, his head in his hands. Around me murmurs rose, gasps echoed, and I felt something inside me unclench. Justice wasn't swift, but it was merciless. The judge, a woman with eyes like iron, spoke without sympathy. "Emily Hamilton, you are hereby disbarred from practicing law in the state of Georgia. You will pay restitution and serve probation." Mark Hamilton, your fraudulent actions have left a trail of financial misconduct. You will also serve probation and repay damages. Both of you stand disgraced in the eyes of this court and your community. The gavel cracked against the wood, and just like that, the world they had stolen crumbled into dust. But the punishment stretched far beyond the legal sentence. Emily's name vanished from her firm's website overnight. Her elegant apartment in Buckhead went up for sale within weeks. The Atlanta social circles that once toasted her success now whispered about her betrayal. I heard she couldn't walk into a room without eyes burning into her back, people pulling away, as though her very presence was contagious. Mark fared worse. The gambling debts he'd tried to hide came crashing down on him. Creditors lined up one after another until he was forced to sell his Lexus and the condo. He bragged about friends who once laughed at his barroom jokes, now crossed the street to avoid him. The city that had once been his playground turned its back on him completely. And me. I walked out of that courthouse with my inheritance restored, the properties transferred back under my name. The inn, that historic place my parents had loved, came alive again under my care. I hired a young, eager manager, someone honest, someone who reminded me of what family used to mean before greed poisoned it. I walked the halls of the Whitaker Street house, running my fingers over the banisters, feeling as though the walls themselves had sighed with relief. For months afterward, I tasted victory in everything. Each rent check deposited, each contract signed each day. The inn's guests filled its rooms. It all felt like a resurrection of my parents' legacy. Their sacrifices had not been erased, but revenge isn't just about reclaiming what was stolen. True revenge is about making your enemy live with the knowledge of their failure. One evening, about a year after the verdict, I returned home to find an envelope on my porch. No return address. My name scrawled in handwriting I recognized, but could not immediately place. Inside was a single sentence. "We never thought you had it in you. I read it twice, then tucked it into the drawer where I kept the forged will's photographs. Proof not only of their crime, but of their defeat. Proof that Emily and Mark now lived every day, knowing the old uncle they dismissed had orchestrated their ruin. Sometimes late at night, I sit by the window of the Whitaker Street house with a glass of bourbon I still don't care for. The cicadas sing in the dark. The oak branches scrape against the glass, and I whisper into the silence. Neither did I. The end.